Welcome to episode 3 of Reclining at Table with Jesus. In episode 2, we started to think about what the Bible has to say on suffering. And we saw from Hebrews 12, verse 11, that suffering is painful and not pleasant. And again, if you've got a Bible, let's turn back to Hebrews 12, verse 11. And John Newton called suffering the bitter tree. But he says that the bitter tree, by God's grace, can produce good fruit. And verse 11 shows that if you're trained by suffering, by God's grace, we can bear the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And in the next episode, we will consider some of the good fruit that is produced by the bitter tree. But the fact is, in the book of Hebrews and in the Bible, we see people who are going through suffering, the bitter tree, and the fruit it produces is bad and bitter. And I just want us to just watch our hearts, whether we've been through difficult times, going through difficult times, or will go through suffering in difficult times in the future, that we allow the discipline of the Lord to produce good fruit and not bad fruit. So what we see in chapter 12 is this church is becoming weary in verse 3, faint-hearted, and in verse 5 they are regarding the discipline of the Lord lightly. They are struggling under this bitter tree, and it's close to producing bad fruit. There are 5 warnings that the writer gives to the church in the book of Hebrews. So you will see the first one in chapter 2, verse 1 to verse 4. So if you've got a Bible, please come with me to Hebrews 2, verse 1 to 4. And the first danger suffering can cause to our hearts in verse 1 is it can cause us to drift away. The second warning comes in chapter 3, verse 7, down to the end of chapter 4. And he says in verse 12, we've got to be careful that we don't have an unbelieving heart that leads us to fall away. So we can drift away in chapter 2, verse 1, and we can fall away in chapter 3, verse 12. And the third warning comes in chapter 5, verse 11, down to chapter 6, verse 12. And the danger here can be explained in 2 ways. In verse 11 of chapter 5, we can become dull of hearing. And in chapter 6, verse 12, we can become sluggish. Then the fourth warning comes in chapter 10, verse 19 to the end of the chapter. And he says in verse 24, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works. And he says in verse 25, do not neglect to meet with one another. That's one of the things suffering and difficulty can cause. But notice what he says at the end of chapter 10. Suffering can cause us to shrink back. And then the fifth warning comes in chapter 12, probably verse 12 beginning to the end of the chapter. But in verse 25, suffering can do something on us that causes us to refuse to listen to God when he speaks to us. So there's been 5 warnings to this church as they're going through suffering, and they've got to be careful that this bitter tree produces good fruit and not bad fruit. And some of the bad fruit is that they fall away, they have a hard heart, they drift away, they become sluggish, dull of hearing, they shrink back, and they can refuse to listen to God. But as we look at the Bible just really quickly, we think of Exodus and Pharaoh, how God sent 10 plagues to him so that he would turn from his sin, he would worship God, and he would allow God's people to go into freedom and into worship. And 3 times it says that he hardened his heart. The suffering and the difficulty that came to him didn't produce a soft heart, it produced a hard heart. What about Job's wife in chapter 2, and I think it's verse 9 and verse 10. It's interesting how the same fire which softens wax can harden the clay. So Job goes on not to sin with his mouth in verse 10 of chapter 2, but his wife in verse 9 says, curse God and die. What about Jonah in Jonah chapter 4? God causes a plant to grow over him in verse 5 onwards of chapter 4. And he's happy with it because it gives him shade. But then God causes a worm in the morning to rise up and to eat the plant, and he becomes extremely angry to the point that he wants to die. And God says, do you do well to be angry? And then we've got Naomi in Ruth chapter 1, and especially in verse 20 as she goes back to the people of God in Bethlehem. Her name Naomi means pleasant, but she says, God has dealt so bitterly with me, my name is Mara, which means bitter. I went away full, but I've come back empty. So Jonah was angry. Naomi became bitter. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Job's wife cursed. So sometimes the bitter tree can produce bad fruit. And as saints, we've got to watch our hearts with all diligence, that the discipline and the suffering that we go through, by God's grace, will produce good fruit. So let me encourage you to sit at table with Jesus and ask him, ask the good doctor to do heart surgery on us, that our hearts would produce good fruit, the peaceful fruit of righteousness. He is our anchor in chapter 6 of Hebrews verse 19, sure and steadfast, gone in behind the curtain. So come to him in the storm of your life, in the darkness and in the midst of the wind and the waves. Remember, Jesus Christ is our anchor. You may not see him because you don't see an anchor at work, and you may not see him now, but trust he is there. He's holding on to you, and in the storm he will not let you go. And notice this anchor is above you and not below you. You push the anchor off a boat and it goes down, but by here he's gone up into heaven, and the anchor will pull you to himself. Jesus Christ is sure and steadfast. All other ground is sinking sand, but Jesus Christ is an anchor and a rock to our souls. So please come to him, consider him, and allow him to be your anchor in the midst of your storm. So may the Lord bless you and keep you today. Amen.